Hi, Heathens. Welcome to a very special, let me mute this. Oof, technology, a very special panel. I'm super excited to have these three distinguished guests join me today to talk about the historicity of the Exodus. So many of you will know Dr. Josh. We also have Dr. Kara Cooney and Dr. Mark Leuchter. Leuchter, I can never pronounce it. I'm so sorry. I'm trying so hard. What I would like to do is have each of them sort of tell you a little bit about themselves, who they are, what they do, and then we can sort of jump right into the questions. So, Dr. Josh, you want to kick it off?
Oh, sure. So Joshua Bowen, I am an Assyriologist. I got my degree from Johns Hopkins, and it was a major in Assyriology and a minor in Hebrew Bible. So I help out Megan on our YouTube channel, Digital Hammurabi, and we talk about the ancient Near East and do a lot of sort of, dealing with bad apologetics, Christian apologetics. So, yeah, that's sort of what we do.
Are there good apologetics? Because I haven't encountered any.
I haven't seen any, but
we're going to keep an eye out, though. Dr. Cooney, would you like to go next?
Yeah, my name's Kara Cooney, and there are two of me, if you like. There's the good version of me, which is the department chair, and I'm a social historian, and I'm a coffin specialist and crisis specialist. And then there's the bad version of me, which is an outreach public scholar who talks about the politics of Egyptology and ancient Egypt and pisses off her colleagues. So.
Oh, I'm all for pissing off your colleagues. Good trouble. All right. And we're going to call you Dr. Mark. So I don't ruin your name again.
That's fine. No, that's okay. I was brought up with the pronunciation Leuchter, but I was quickly corrected by my German colleagues that no, that's not the right way to say it.
Nice.
I don't want to upset them. So yeah, as he's Leuchter, I'm like, okay. And
what did you say?
Yeah, seriously. So my name is Mark Leuchter. There's only one of me, and it's all bad. And I don't think I piss off my colleagues. I just think I frustrate them. And because I come to class wearing T-shirts like this,
I love it.
And the students, yeah, I mean, it reaches the students. If you're gonna lecture on the golden rule at some point, you might as well, wear it on your chest if you can, and make it accessible. So I teach at Temple University. I did my PhD at University of Toronto. In Hebrew Bible and ancient Judaism, and that's what I've been doing ever since.
Awesome. I do have to, Josh, since he showed his shirt, I think you must show yours.
Yeah, so I'm trying to
Kara,
up my game.
This is mine.
If you all are dying to see my sweater, awesome. Okay. I did want to say, so I know I had mentioned that Megan would be here co-hosting. She might still for the second half. She has to put the baby Hammurabis down for a nap. And I know one of them probably is teething and so has been screaming all morning. So we're just going to let Megan come in if she can. Otherwise, just have to hope I can do it, Okay, so why don't we jump right in? I'm going to assume that most of the people that are watching this know the biblical narrative, but in case they don't, Mark, would you mind giving a brief overview, or Josh?
Sure. Josh, do you want to do it? Do you want me to do it? I'm Canadian.
Go for it.
I will defer to you.
You should tag team it. A little bit here.
Josh, this is what you should do. Josh, you beatbox. And then Mark, you rap the historical narrative. Okay,
that's a terrible idea. I'm sorry. I have to call that out for what it is.
Okay, fine. I tried.
Okay. Well, I'll just give a very, very brief overview. The Exodus narrative can be found currently in the book of Exodus, which you can find in the Bible, whatever Bible or version of the Bible you have. It's in just about all of them. And it is the story of how a man named Moses, with the help of a deity who reveals his name to be Yahweh, leads the people of Israel out of Egypt after several centuries of servitude to the Egyptians. And of course, depending on how you view the story, there could be a bit of a preamble to that with the whole Joseph story and the descent into Egypt. And there's, the stuff that happens afterwards as they're wandering in the desert en route to Mount Sinai. But the Exodus story itself is just basically what I described. Tag.
Josh, would you mind telling folks sort of, I know we're going to get into this a lot later, but the general, sort of the two sides to the dating that people give, right? Like people think it's the later date, the earlier date, and just a general idea of when people think this event would have taken place.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are lots of different views. If people want a nice overview of them, Lawrence Garrity in the 2015 The Exodus, the Transdisciplinary Approach, it's something like that, has an article where he sort of goes through the current scholarship, at least up to that point. The two big ones that you see out and about here on social media are the more traditional date, which is sometime in the 15th century. And so, this is based on sort of internal biblical chronology from like 1 Kings 6 and from Judges 11, where it's like right in the middle of the 15th century, there's supposed to be an Exodus, and then 40 years later, the conquest of Canaan. That one has sort of gone by the wayside, except for a very few more fringe conservative evangelical scholars. Most people, again, not my area of expertise, but most people that I think you come across would say if there is a historical kernel or historical veracity of any kind to the Exodus as a more singular event, then they would say it happened probably sometime in the 13th century or maybe even the early 12th. But that's because of archaeology, right? I mean, archaeology and of course Egyptology has driven that that date because I think more traditional conservative scholars have realized that a 15th century date just does not work in any way, and so
it also, if I'm not right, doesn't fit with the Exodus story itself because Pithom and Ramses are mentioned as cities, right? So it's you have to explain that away.
Yeah,
got to explain lots of stuff away.
I mean,
small problem.
So I guess that's a good place to jump in. The first sort of question we had was what the consensus of Egyptologists is regarding the legitimacy of the Exodus. And I feel like I know the answer to this question, but I would like you to speak on it.
I mean, I'll be really blunt with this in that, some of the memes where that are going around now that the Queen is dead, and I see things like British people, are so dismissive of Americans and think Americans are stupid, and then you see the meme where Americans say, "Oh, well, we don't think of you at all." So this is kind of like that for most Egyptologists, from my perspective, that everyone's freaking out about this extraordinary event that happened thousands of years ago. And what do Egyptologists think of it? Well, most Egyptologists don't think of it at all. They don't care. It's not a part of their narrative. It's very fringe. Egyptologists who work with Levantine Egyptian hybrid connections are like, yeah, it's not an event. We're not even going to touch it because it lacks historicity. And so even those specialists don't talk about it. So it's something I think you used to get a lot more of with the Jan Assmann narratives, but now that Assmann is retired and we moved on from him as one of the leading lights of Egyptology, you see much less discussion of it. There's James Hoffmeyer, of course, but most Egyptologists would be like, yes, but it's not core Egyptology. And so most Egyptologists don't think of it at all. But if I'm going to give my personal Exodus take as a scholar of crisis of the late Bronze, then I would tell you that it's not an event, it's a process, which I know we all agree on. We agreed on this via email earlier, but it's also the very interesting, for me, it's the long, slow train wreck of the fall of the Bronze Age, palace economies, however you want to define that in scare quotes, kingship as a thing. And it's really the last heydays of Egyptian kingship happening over, falling over centuries. And if you want to link it to that long, slow train wreck of the Egyptian kingly demise, then that works really well. It works really well. It's perfect. It's perfect. So.
Thank you. sorry to sort of break this here. Your audio is giving us a bunch of static. I was wondering if you might try like reconnecting or something like that.
Yeah. Or I can just.
Is this better?
Yeah. Perfect.
Okay. I just undid
Awesome.
my super fancy mic, because sometimes super fancy mics are not the way it should be. So there we go.
No, that's okay. Thank you. Yeah. I think
no problem.
I'll double check. People in the chat, let me know. It sounds better to me. I just want to make sure it sounds better to everyone else. Sorry about that.
No. All good.
Let's see. And okay. So correct me if I'm wrong here, any of you. This sort of largely agreed upon date for the Exodus is happening in New Kingdom, Egypt.
Yeah, at the very end of the New Kingdom, and into either the 19th or the 20th dynasties, if we're going with the 13th to 11th centuries BC.
Okay. And what is going on in Egypt at that time?
A whole lot. You have Ramses the First taking over the 19th dynasty and taking that from an 18th dynasty, very strong Theban familial power. And the 19th dynasty is instead an East Delta / slightly Levantine mercenary family, or at least a family of generals with coming from military communities of practice. And they set up a very different kind of kingship. What I argue in my last book, The Good Kings, is very much a populist kingship. And that kingship involves creating a base of priests and military officers who need to be fed. It involves creating a base of nepotism that also needs to be fed. And so it's no surprise that just a few generations after the fall of Ramses II, or death of Ramses II, you see Egypt splitting into a civil war, end of the 19th dynasty. And then they're able to bring it back together with another mercenary general coming from a community of military practice, and that would be Setnacht, and that's the 20th dynasty. And then you get Sea People's invasions, and Ramses III can repel them, but it fits somewhere in this Sturm und Drang, to go for some German, of the late Bronze, when everything is falling apart. Really, these palace economies, whatever we think of them, however we want to define them, are falling, and new things are taking their place. Do we want to use the word like proto-nation state? But there's identity built into this, an association with place that is arguably new, and this is the zeitgeist that I think we're fitting this into.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Mark?
I do. My work is not on the Egyptian side of things, but on the sort of the fallout of what's happening in Egypt, and the echoes of it throughout the Cisjordan and the Transjordan, very shortly thereafter. And there is this renewed interest in understanding shifting boundaries and shifting ethnic identity at this time. It in some ways, it's a bit of a free-for-all from, let's say, 1200 BCE down to roughly 1000 BCE, give or take a couple of years. You have lots of different populations that would come to reside in an area that we might eventually identify as the Northern Kingdom of Israel or the Southern Kingdom of Judah. But they didn't see themselves that way. It's only in retrospect that ancient writers are assigning ethnic labels or ancestral labels to them. So there's very much a sort of a shifting sands from one region to another at this time, because of this implosion of economic stability and finance and thus all the things that revolve around that define identity. And when you don't have that, then all kinds of new options seem to pop up, including the option to take to the hills as a disaffected group of former Canaanites, mix it up with a couple disaffected former nomadic groups from the east, and call yourselves Yisrael or Israel right at around the same time.
Very
now
interesting.
I have run to the hills in my head now.
Awesome.
I don't know if it's just here, but I just have Running Up the Hill by Kate Bush because it's been playing on the radio nonstop.
Yeah.
I think thanks to Stranger Things or something. Anyway.
Yeah, but there's the intergenerational difference, because Kara and I think we must have grown up in the Iron Maiden days.
Yeah.
And Run to the Hills is what came into my head also.
Josh, did you have anything to add to that, or anything you wanted to say?
No, no, I think they covered it far, far better than I could. And Oliver's also screaming, so sorry.
No problem. Okay,
Wait
so the
till
next.
my son barges in. It's going to happen. So it'll be exciting. Can I
Okay.
ask your bingo card? Yeah.
Yeah, doesn't bother me any. Mark, this question is largely directed at you, but obviously anyone that has thoughts or information can chime in. What are the earliest references to the Exodus? Do they describe the Exodus event as it's described in the Hebrew Bible, or are they different traditions? And then is there a difference between the Exodus story in the North, South, and Transjordan? And I will happy to repeat any of that because it was a lot.
Well, why don't we take the first part? References to the Exodus outside of the Exodus story. I mean, there's quite a bit, but they're more of references to a break with Egypt as opposed to references to an Exodus event. So, for example, in the book of Hosea, which derives, and most scholars I think would agree with me, in large part from the 8th century prophetic tradition of the prophet Hosea, and probably preserves a lot of his oracles, or at least the substance of his oracles. Hosea, already sometime around 730 BCE in the northern kingdom of Israel, knows the Exodus and sees it as a sort of defining mythology. It is what makes him an Israelite. It is what makes Israel Israel. But he defines it in terms that are a little looser and freer and not so bound to a particular narrative, such as what we find in Exodus chapters 1 to 15. So there's a lot of evidence that the prophets of the 8th century know an Exodus tradition, and there's even evidence that earlier writers and earlier thinkers or earlier rhetoric reflects an Exodus tradition. But it's not quite the narrative that we're all kind of used to from watching the movies, or sitting in a congregation and listening to somebody preach about it. In my opinion, and the last book that I wrote, which came out at this point quite a while ago in 2017, I did an analysis of Exodus chapter 15, which is called the Song of the Sea. And most scholars would agree that the Song of the Sea is probably the oldest single text in the Hebrew Bible. There are scholars who disagree, but I think the majority agree that that poem is very, 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 very old. Some would date it to the 12th century. So within a century or so of there ever being in Israel attested in archaeological evidence. And this very, very ancient poem speaks about some kind of break with Egypt or tension with Egypt, but it thinks of it more in agrarian terms and in a sort of like leaving of a particular place and going to a particular place set of terms. It's much more about leaving behind a political influence and finding yourself anew in a land that you can define on your own terms. And that seems to be what the prophet Hosea and later Jeremiah are tapping into when they're referring to in Exodus from Egypt. It's not necessarily the canonical version that I think most people today are probably familiar with.
And can I just jump in and put this into a larger picture too? Because as you move from our artificially constructed Bronze Age to the Iron Age, right? It's still at this time period the death of Egypt. It really is. Egypt is never the same again after the fall of the 20th dynasty, and even from the middle of the 20th dynasty onward. Egypt will end up being colonized by a series of imperial forces in the days to come. And Egypt as an entity of strength and power on the geopolitical landscape is done. So your idea of Pharaoh falling, his army being crushed, you can think of this in all kinds of metaphorical ways, but Egypt's, no matter what's said in the second Kings about Egypt doing this or that, I mean, they're nothing on the political landscape compared to what they were. And I think everyone is grappling with that. Everyone's trying to figure it out, kind of like in the same way that one grapples with the loss of the British Empire. How do you understand what was a great force is now much less and is diminished? How do we deal with those diminished powers on the world stage? And I think a lot of this narrative is working with that.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Let's see. I've already forgot the second part of that question. Sorry.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. I think so. Here, is there or are there differences between the Exodus story in the North, South, or Transjordan areas?
I will only say very briefly, yes, because if I was going to go into much more detail than that, I mean, we'd just be here for a month solid. So I'll just say this much. In 1989, so already, a number of decades ago, an Israeli scholar named Yair Hoffman published
That's
a very,
the year
very...
I was born, please.
So, okay. So a lifetime ago for some people. Yair Hoffman published a really good article where he compared the references to the Exodus in the oracles of Hosea, who I already mentioned, and references to the Exodus in the oracles of Amos, who's living just before Hosea, but basically is a contemporary. Amos is from the south, Hosea is from the north. And southern references to the Exodus in Amos's work conceive of it as a distant historical event, a memory, an important, sort of collective experience, but not definitive of identity. Whereas in Hosea's work, the Exodus can constantly happen because it's mythological. And when I say myth, I think most of us would agree we're using myth with the big M, and we're not talking about it as a misconception or a falsehood, but we're talking about it as something that is beyond the limits of history, but that informs our understanding of it and our identity within it. And so for Northerners, the Exodus was a kind of a state myth. Like the North was what it was because of this Exodus myth. And we can talk more about why that's the case, because there actually is an event behind that. But for the Southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, there's a recollection of something akin to an Exodus, or some kind of loose tradition, but it's not definitive for them in terms of their sense of royal or societal identity.
Okay. I actually just thought of this question. I didn't tell you I was going to ask it, but I have a feeling you'll know anyway. When do we first see writings about the Exodus? Like when was this narrative written, or when do we think it was written? Any thoughts?
Does anybody else want to go? I mean, I have a couple ideas, but I'm just throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. That's my career in a nutshell.
Okay, it seems to be working so far. Okay. Josh?
Oh no, certainly Mark.
Yeah,
Mark is definitely far more versed on this part than I am, no doubt.
All right, here we go. So when I said that there was an event that actually stands behind the Exodus narrative, I think there is indeed one event that really does stand behind the Exodus narrative, or at least the definitive outline of what we currently have. But it's not a departure from Egypt. It's the leaving of the northern tribes from Davidic rule in the south. And many scholars, myself included, have observed that when you take a look at the oldest layers of the Exodus story and related literature, the Exodus seems to be a metaphor for King Jeroboam, the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel, leading Israel away from King Solomon and his son Rehoboam immediately after his death. And there are tremendous parallels there. So what a lot of scholars think, and I've written on this, but the real great work was done many years before I did mine. These scholars who pioneered this way of thinking about it have noted that the Moses story, the Exodus story, probably was written down as propaganda for Jeroboam as he's founding the northern kingdom. And it's drawing on memories that the kings in Jerusalem conscripted labor from the northern populace to build the palace in Jerusalem and the temple in Jerusalem. And Pitom and Ramses in Hebrew refer to, this is a convoluted argument, but there's some weight behind it, refer to temple complexes and palace complexes. And there's two unnamed Egyptian pharaohs in the Exodus story, right? There's the one who enslaves the Israelites or the Hebrews, and then there's the one that Moses has to deal with, who's the son of the one who enslaved them. And that is roughly analogous to King Solomon conscripting people into labor, and then his son coming up after him, finally forcing the northern tribes to say, "Screw you guys, we're going home." In the Cartman voice and everything. And so, if you didn't get that reference, then you're not watching enough South Park. So I do think that there is a historical core to the Exodus story if we're looking at it as a political metaphor and as a myth for political identity. And that early core is probably written in the late 10th century or very early 9th century BCE.
Awesome. Thank you. Josh, isn't there an Assyrian or a Sumerian myth story that closely resembles the story of Moses?
Yeah, it's complicated. So you have the birth, and I'm noticing that was probably not one of those questions that was pre-selected either, but
off the old dome,
Yeah. So I just want to say before I answer that, this is one of the things that I'm so happy about with a panel like this. When you come to an ancient text and you're looking at it very myopically, like, okay, well, this has to be an inspired text and it has to be historically inerrant or, whatever, you lose what I think is the beauty of nuance. And just listening and thinking again about some of these things, I think people would do very well in the audience to just sort of let go of that more fundamentalist approach, because we see it all the time, and say that there's a lot more to these texts than just slavishly reading them, as maybe you were raised in a particular church to do. So anyway,
Are you saying that Christians need to practice nuance?
we all do.
You,
Right? We all do.
Choose to.
Hey, I didn't say it.
So the
Atheist
birth
three.
the birth legend of Sargon is a little bit complicated in that it's a later text. I haven't looked, recently at when the what tablets we have. I think they're from the Neo-Assyrian period. So in the first millennium. Does it go back to the late second millennium? I don't know. Again, I haven't read the secondary literature on it recently, but
What?
But yes, so there is sort of this exposure, type of story, right? Where you have somebody who is exposed at birth and then cared for. So here in the Sargon birth legend, you have Sargon who is put into a reed basket and he's let, to drift in the water, and then he's drawn out by Aki, the water drawer. And, of course, Sargon, his name is the king is legitimate in Akkadian, which means he probably wasn't. But these sorts of things, you have these sorts of stories, not that one specifically, but these sort of mysterious backgrounds to Sargon's birth or to his lineage or whatever. And they go back into like Sumerian texts and early Akkadian texts. But yes, there's certainly a connection there in the birth of legend of Sargon. But it would be nicer for this argument of, that the Hebrew Bible is drawing on the birth legend of Sargon text or something like it, if it were datable to the second millennium somehow. And maybe it can be, and I just haven't read those arguments in a while. But yes, there is. But it does seem like it's sort of a theme that we see in ancient texts, this sort of exposure and rise to power.
Awesome. And if you are interested, not you, Josh, personally, because you were there, in a conversation about whether or not the Hebrew Bible is plagiarized, because that's a common argument you hear a lot, especially in sort of these circles. Not these as in you guys, these as in like the atheist community. Josh and I did an entire show on it a while back, so you can go find that there. All right. Sorry.
Oh,
okay.
No, I don't think I had anything to say. I think I just moved my jaw.
Oh, sorry. Okay, just no more jaw moving. I think this question is for Josh, but I didn't label it. So James Hoffmeyer has argued that if the quote-unquote stage on which the Exodus is played out, this lends general credibility to the historical veracity of the Exodus as described in the Pentateuch. What do scholars in the fields of biblical studies and archaeology think about this methodology? Should we begin with the general trust of the book of Exodus from a historical standpoint? Guys, you're supposed to let me get that out seriously.
So I'm going to give the fastest answer that I can, because I want to hear what both of them have to say about it. So yes, somebody like James Hoffmeyer, who's an Egyptologist, and
I don't know.
Sorry, I'll be very fast now.
Do you want to? Well, I
tell you what. Why don't everybody probably knows what my opinion is on this? Why don't you guys answer it so that we can all enjoy it? And if you don't,
you should go read his book. Buy it and read it.
Kara, do you want to go ahead?
I mean, there's all kinds of attempts to. It drives all of us crazy when people are trying to fit in these narratives, which we would like to be nuanced and explain larger. Identity building and larger political shifts when we try to identify them directly. This person is this, and this historical entity is that character. I think it drives us all a bit crazy. And so I think, what Hoffmeyer is saying, okay, is if we agree that it fits into the 19th and 20th dynasties, now what can we do? And then it creates a discussion where it's all in the weeds, which we can do. We can discuss how Amenmesu, the guy who was fighting Seti II in the civil war at the end of the 19th dynasty, is called Mesu for short, which is Moses in a sense. And what does that mean? And people's heads can explode. And oh my God, is that Moses? And then we make these one-to-one correlations, and it doesn't help at all, because it's not helping us to understand how this story was constructed over generations, orally, I have to assume at first, though I'm not the expert here, and then written down for a political purpose at some point, and then made scriptural such that it cannot change. So, you know, we can get in the weeds, but I don't find it that helpful. But there's all kinds of stuff that one can discuss to look at Levantine Egyptian interaction in the 19th and 20th dynasties. And we can go there. We can talk about the Merneptah stela. We can talk about Chancellor Bai, a Syrian man who's a money man, to get all our stereotypes going crazy, coming from West Asia, right? And he's there running things, running the political show in the 19th dynasty. We can talk about Setnach's text, where he takes over at the end of the civil war and defeats a person. This is Ramses III plus Setnach, defeats Yersu, an Egyptian, the one who made himself. And he's associated with Bai and the Syrian person. And there's all kinds of details that one could connect to this. But does that help? You know, does it help to locate this? Should we locate this specifically? I don't think so, but I'll let Mark jump in if baby's still screaming.
And whoever's jumping in, excuse me for 1 second. My dogs are ensuring that I'm going to get evicted, so I'm going to call them in really quick.
Okay. Well, I'll pick up on that because I agree 100%. And you know, I remember I engaged that kind of work in the last serious, you know, research I did on Sinai and the Sinai tradition, and I can't remember the context in which I said it. I know I repeated this in an email in an earlier exchange that we all had with each other, but it's the kind of logic that basically says, I found a sled in the Arctic Circle in northern Canada. This is proof that Santa Claus is real. I mean, it's the same kind of reductive logic. You have to ignore a tremendous amount of important evidence in order to take a tiny little shred of evidence and expand it into something that fills all the voids that you're left with. And that's not good scholarship. Now, I will never tell somebody that I can prove that the Exodus didn't happen. And I will never tell somebody I can prove that this story is completely false. And I always actually have a problem when people, I'm not an angry problem, but I do take some issue when people just say, this is all just fiction, it's all just a fairy tale. Because no, it's not. I mean, if you just want to dismiss the contents of the Hebrew Bible, or for that matter, the New Testament, as, you know, just fiction and just a fairy tale, then you miss the purpose that it served and what it tells us about the communities that it was meant to address initially, and something about the authors themselves and the worlds in which they lived. And I think the same thing can be said about the Exodus story. If you try to fit, you know, little wisps of details that one finds in the Exodus story into a theologically informed narrative, you have to ignore other details in the Exodus story that go against it. And as a colleague of mine recently said on Twitter, I mean, anybody who reads the Bible for religious purposes is always picking and choosing. And okay, that's fine. That's how people have been reading the Bible for, you know, the better part of 2,000 years. But as academics, we have to be more responsible about what we're picking and choosing and why. And if we're picking and choosing something because we can only focus on, you know, such a range of issues in a particular paper or book, that's fine. But if we're picking and choosing something because the stuff we're leaving out upsets us on a theological level, that's, you know, that's not good methodology. And I think you at least have to be honest about why you're doing that. And I'm not sure that some of these scholars are.
Can I jump in for the Egyptological elephant in the room, which I think is so very interesting, which is why Egyptologists don't like to talk about the Exodus, because it pinpoints and describes the fall of the place that they love so much and identify with so much. And no one wants to see that. No one wants to talk about it. Most Egyptologists focus on pre-dynastic to 20th dynasty and then don't do as much with time periods later on. I mean, in the United States in particular, that's an arguable point, but this story, from my perspective, is so very valuable because it is giving a non-Egypt perspective on what is lost when Egypt is lost on the world stage politically, and how it is lost, and that it's not necessarily Pharaoh's fault in a sense, that it's fated, that God is going to harden his heart and there's nothing anyone can do about it. And it's just something, it's a rite of passage that we all have to go through. And then we all have to work with that. Then you see a community rather imploding from the inside out because they can't work with this idea of not having an overlay of power. And they have to work among themselves to figure out how to do self-governance. And they're not very good at it. And they have to figure out where to go. And they're not very good at getting to where they need to go. And they're not really good at figuring out what their new identity and their new place will be. And to me, this is a larger loss that the Egyptians are actually grappling with at the same time. And people of the Delta are grappling with, like, what the hell do we do? Are we Libyans? Libyans are kings now as we move into the 21st dynasty. What's a Libyan? What's a sea person? What is all of this immigration? What are all these military communities of practice that are now ruling us in a decentralized way? This decentralization is really, I think, the core of this text, and that's where I need it. Then it gets really interesting. Then it doesn't matter who's who and all of the weeds. Then it's putting it onto a larger geopolitical stage, and it's mega cool.
There's also something else which just occurred to me as you were speaking, and I hadn't thought about this before, but it makes sense in light of what you're talking about. You know, for the longest time, life in the region that we call Canaan was dominated by decisions being made west of Canaan. And the Exodus story is essentially about how a deity from the eastern regions, outside of the reach of the Egyptian empire in the west, starts calling the shots in that territory. I mean, so there's a real sort of reckoning with a shift in cultural influence, and even maybe a sense that, you know, forces from the east are going to start having a much greater impact on life for people living in this, you know, more liminal position.
And can I just jump in with a big, bold, provocative statement and say that forces from the east are a lot crueler and more competitive and more militaristically brutal than forces from the west. You know, Egypt has its stereotypes for a reason. And while Egypt may come in and smash people beneath their sandal, you know, in their texts and things like that, they're not the best military force. They're not imperial, in my opinion. That's its own discussion. They're a hegemonic force that goes up to the Orontes, and that's kind of it. They go down to the second cataract, maybe third, and that's kind of it. They don't expand beyond that. They're not what these imperial forces will be. This is also, I agree, Mark, like a reckoning with, holy crap, how are we going to deal with this new imperial world that we're a part of? And Yahweh is kind of a part of that whole, I mean, we know this, Yahweh is the rod of God, and he's the one that's going to smite them through Assyria in many later texts. But it's like, this could be the beginning of that discussion, which is really interesting, because you're leaving the softer, gentler hegemony behind, i.e. Egypt, and you're moving on to something that's much more brutal in its modus operandi.
Josh, are you able to jump in now?
Yes. I think she took him upstairs. So, yeah, I mean, I think this is so exciting to me. I'm just really happy to be here and listen to these things. I hope everybody else is enjoying it. I want to take just a step back to talk about sort of the broader methodology, as, you know, Mark was kind of talking about it. You know, one of the nice things about being an Assyriologist is that we have all these extant texts, right? We get to hold cuneiform tablets, so, you know, suck it. But the problem is that this idea of, well, we have a text, and this text is centuries later, many centuries later. And of course, even the extant manuscripts that we have are, you know, at least 1,000 years later in the Dead Sea Scrolls, than the time of, you know, actual perhaps beginning of composition or whatever. So to have this idea that we're just going to start with this text and we're going to assume its general historical validity is problematic for me, right? And I say that coming from a discipline where, like, if we read about the Great Revolt of Naram Sin, in the 24th century, like 24th or 23rd, I can't remember. But Naram Sin has this standard, this inscription that is everywhere, right? They have tons of it, tons of copies of this thing, and they're all from contemporaneous sources. And the story talks about how he fought these 9 battles in 1 year, and all the North and the South rebelled against him. We have the king's names, we have the cities' names, and he does such a great job defending Agade from destruction, that all the people of the city pray to the gods that he be made a god, right? He be deified. Well, like, not only do we have it in that inscription that happens, but we have, the victory stele of Naram Sin, where he's wearing the horned headdress, right? And he's bigger than everybody else. And the text says that he's a god. It has the divine determinative in front of his name. We have administrative texts that start to appear with the divine determinative in front of his name. So if I were trying to do like a minimal facts argument here for Naram Sin being deified, I'd have a pretty strong case, right? Because I've got administrative texts that are probably, not biased in the same way as like a royal inscription would be. I feel like I could build a pretty strong contemporaneous case, but nobody would buy that, right? Because we know what texts do. We understand the propagandistic function. We understand why they say what they say. But when we come to something like the Hebrew Bible, it's like a lot of times that shit just goes out the window, right? Look, look at this. We've got this city, and we've got this path, and we've got Migdol, and we've got this Papyrus Anastasi, what is it, 5, where it shows the path out, and it sort of matches up with the Exodus. And so look, it seems like it's pretty close, and we should be able to just start with this assumption that it's generally historically reliable. And I would say no. I mean, let's say you want to do that. Fine. As Karen and Mark have been pointing out, there are lots of problems with just slavishly understanding it that way. So even if you're starting with this idea that, yes, it's historically reliable, generally speaking, once you start bumping your nose into the problems, you have to say with some honesty, maybe we should be looking at this a different way. And so that's why I have problems with some of these methodological approaches that have theological commitments. And I feel like it's starting with your conclusion and backing into the data. Mm-hmm. That's what it feels like to me.
And as Pat pointed out, I think you just don't have the Holy Spirit. So
not anymore, right?
That's the real problem here.
Yeah.
You can't truly understand.
I've gotten that from students. Like I remember, I teach an intro to Bible course. Yeah, I teach an intro to Bible course, and I remember the first couple of years that I was teaching it if you're an undergraduate student and you come from a religious background, you think, oh, I'll take this course because I want to indulge in my own faith identity, and this will just be an easy A anyway. And then like 2 or 3 lectures into it, invariably I would get somebody, and I'm not kidding, like clockwork.
Crisis.
Yeah, they would stand up and they would tell me I was going to hell, and they'd march out. And so now at the beginning of every intro to Bible class that I teach, I just tell all the students on the count of 3 to tell me that I'm going to hell, so we can just get it out of the way and then just get on with it. And so like the chair of my department, I remember walked by the room when I had about 200 students shout at me, "You're going to hell." And he was like, "What have we done hiring this guy? We're in big trouble." But what winds up happening is that once you kind of break the ice that way, then you can start suggesting what Josh has just suggested, that like you can't back into the evidence. It doesn't mean that the argument that you're making should be taken as, divine truth, or should replace revelation, or should replace your religious identity. It doesn't. You're doing something very different in an academic setting than somebody would be doing in a synagogue or a church or temple or whatever it might be. It doesn't make sense. Like it doesn't matter what we do academically very often to people who are asking the text different kinds of questions that are spiritually based. By the same token, you can't import spiritually oriented methods of inquiry into an academic context. It's just not playing fair.
Can I give a small analogy, which I think might be useful? And it helps me to see it more clearly. And from the Egyptological perspective, you might be like, oh, who's going to believe in ancient Egypt? It's never going to really happen. However, there is a very large Mormon community, LDS community, in California. attending UCLA, and I've had many of these students in my class who look at Egyptian texts as through the eyes of Joseph Smith and the creation of their Book of Abraham and all of these different things. And there are apologist scholars, Carrie Mulstein, John Gee, who participate in Egyptian conferences, etc., and use their Egyptological PhDs to proselytize to their flock and say that the Book of Abraham is actually written down, and the translation from Egyptian hieroglyphs is indeed exactly correct. It may seem extraordinary to us that that could happen, but as I understand, none of us are embedded in the LDS community and context, and thus we can see it with that distance more clearly. But if you are embedded in a Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, it is much more difficult to unpack the pharaoh in the Quranic sense, right, from all of this discussion, or unpack the, the hardened heart of Pharaoh. And we have a very, very hard time finding our way through. We need disassociation. We need distance to be able to see this story much more clearly.
I live in California, and in fact, I live 2 houses up from an LDS church. It's a lot of fun when they come to my door.
Yes.
For all involved, or well, maybe just me. Okay, before we move on to the next question, does anyone else have anything they wanted to add to that question about James Hoffmeyer and credibility and all of that? 3, 2, 1. All right. Question 4 for Kara. If we were going to take the Exodus as described as a historical event, what evidence would we expect to find in the textual sources and the material culture more generally? Do we have any such evidence? And if so, what of, or what about, I guess? And Josh, you'll have to help me on pronunciation here. Betox?
Manfred Betox.
Yeah, Betox article on the 4-room house in the Delta.
Yeah, trying to find identity within architecture, I have a huge problem with this. I thought we decided the pots didn't equal peoples, but there's a whole Amorite discussion happening at my own university. So I think I'm going to walk away from that one slowly. And Betox, I've seen people start screaming at conferences, Betox himself, about chronology and where things should fit. This is what happens when one becomes overly invested in a weeds narrative, in my opinion. And if you tie your own scholarly identity to certain time points and people, place connections, you will lose your shit when you're criticized in any way. And I don't think this is helpful. So I'm gonna back away slowly from that and say that writ large, there is a great deal of evidence for the Exodus narrative in Egyptian data. Didn't expect me to say that, but the evidence is simply that if Pharaoh's army is failing and has, you can say, oh, the details are it's fallen into this sea, which however you want to define that sea, right? It actually has happened. It's true. Egypt's army is failing from Ramses III, the second half of Ramses III on. It is failing. And the king is indeed failing. They can't build anything. They're not able to invade anyone anymore. They're not able to bring in any fresh stone. They're reusing everything that they can. Tomb robbery is a constant. They're actually systematically going into the Valley of the Kings in Thebes to reuse all of the tombs of Amenhotep III, Ramses II, to recommodify these things to fund a new regime. That regime that's building at the end of the 20th dynasty is part Sea People's Libyan, part Egyptian. So you have a new immigrant community coming in embedded with the military community of practice. Everything's up in the air. Everything's decentralized. So writ broadly, the failure of Pharaoh and the failure of his army it's there. It's perfect. So when people get all upset about where it fits and who's this and who's that, the story couldn't line up more perfectly in terms of the absolute fall of power. So that's I don't know if that's answering your question exactly though.
Yeah,
so you want to talk about the 4-room house. Does anyone else want to hit on the 4-room house?
Megan. It's her question. Josh?
No, I think so. Somebody like Abraham Faust wrote a book trying to identify how much we can say from things like architecture and as Kara's pointing out, there's sort of this idea that pots don't equal people, right? There was a long time that, archaeology was like, well, here's a pot and this was made by a certain group of people. And so that must mean this group of people's here, and that doesn't work, right? But, Faust, I think, had a pretty nuanced argument in his monograph where he's, trying to look at how much can we say about things like circumcision or meat consumption, or, for the early proto-Israel, whatever we want to say, in Iron One. But I think this is the sort of thing, and my brain keeps going back because I feel like every week at least I'm confronted on social media in some way with something like the Exodus, and having to say like, oh no, what we see here in the book of Exodus is the divinely inspired word of God, and therefore, this plague happened here, and then the next plague happened here, and then this is where they left, and this is how they came into the land 40 years later. And so, the reason that we won't see this at Jericho is because of it's not because it's a foundational text or something for a people group. No, it's because there's erosion that washed all the late Bronze Age remains away, and that's why we don't see that destruction land. It's like, so that's where my brain keeps going. But really, like what Kara's saying is absolutely correct. Like, yeah, there's lots of evidence, but it's a very nuanced answer that she's giving. But people don't hear the nuance, right? That's a soundbite that certain people will try to pull out, and it's frustrating that we have to deal with that sort of thing.
I mean, the other annoying thing is that people are trying to identify what is Jewish, and good luck, what is Israelite when you've got texts. So if you don't want to make the pots equal peoples and you don't want to deal with the four-room house, then look at the Turin judicial papyrus. And you can see there in this 20th dynasty text that's talking about the regicide of Ramses III and the ensuing investigations, there's a whole number of butlers with West Asian names, Semitic names. What does that mean? Who are these people? Are you going to be able to identify them with Israelites? I don't know, but there's people with West Asian names. They're associated with a coup. Oh my God, that's really cool, right? And why do we not make more out of that? It's there's all kinds of evidence to talk about a very mixed up, or that's not the right word, a very richly multi identity based Egypt in the 19th and 20th dynasties that are all swirling around a kingship that is in its death throes. And I think there's a lot that one could do if we don't myopically attach ourselves to that Hebrew Bible text.
Mm-hmm. I'd also like to add one thing, and I think that this follows up on what both of you have just said. I also periodically get people who really want to line up details of the Exodus story with bits and pieces of evidence over a 1,000 or 2,000 year period from Egyptian records. It's like, if you look at this, record here, if you look at this manuscript here or this papyrus here, that clearly is Aaron, who we read about here, that Moses meets after he leaves and he runs away and he's in the Mount Sinai.
Uh-oh.
And the whole thing. And they lose. What I try to suggest to them is that if you try to reduce a story with so much power, like the Exodus, something that here we are still talking about it now. If you try to reduce it to just a one-to-one, as Josh was saying, like people think it's God's inspired word, therefore it has to have happened. I want to suggest that the traditional way that Jews have read the Exodus is that it's not just a narrative event or a narrative of an actual simple historical event. It's midrashic. Like the word midrash means loosely, it means to interpret or to engage in an act of sacred interpretation. And for everything that you read, the words themselves have a deeper, almost mystical meaning to them. And that can be applied to like esoteric teachings or hermetic teachings. That can be applied to cosmic understandings. It can be applied to social metaphor. I mean, the Exodus story endures the way it does because for a long time it was read metaphorically, and I think it was written. The earliest version was written to be metaphorical, even to this day. I'm not going to tell you what my next birthday is going to be, but I've been around for a while, folks, and I've sat through many a Passover Seder. And there's a point in the Passover Seder when you're reading the Haggadah, which is the sort of like prayer book / guidebook that guides you through the Passover Seder, there's a point in the Haggadah where every participant reads in Hebrew or in English translation, it is incumbent upon every Jew to say to themselves that they left Egypt, not that their ancestors left Egypt, that they left Egypt. Now, I've been saying this. I started talking when I was 18 months old, or something like that. So I've been saying this for like well over 45 years, but I've never been to Egypt. I mean, not once. I'd love to go, but I've never actually been there yet. For 45 plus Passover Seders, I have said I left Egypt. So the whole idea in the Jewish tradition is to read the Exodus story as a basis for forming identity and as a basis for discussing meaningful events in history that might be viewed through the prism of the story, not to see it as just something that happened and clearly it points to something teleological, which I think is how a lot of people who read it, on a literal fundamentalist level try to take it. And it might have that meaning, but that might not be the only meaning. And it's certainly not, I think, the most fruitful way to read it.
And if you look at how it's transmitted into the Quran, then you see that the Pharaoh is like, it's a social understanding of everything that is evil in society, everything that is taking from you. Very apt for discussions about, well, I don't know, Mark Bezos today, right? What is the Pharaoh and how do we discuss it? And when you go on your Hajj and you're throwing stones at the pillar, you are in part throwing stones at the Pharaoh. And so it is yeah, all of these things can be read very metaphorically. As a social historian, it makes perfect sense to me. We just need to get the narrative history out of it, and then you're fine.
I think it's worth saying, and I'm not announcing anything new to any of the panel members here, but we largely, the public, the people that are in my audience, approach our understanding of these texts living in a society and a culture where the evangelical understanding has become effectively hegemonic, right? Everybody views the Bible, everybody views the biblical texts the way that the evangelicals do, largely, because just by sheer volume of literature and media and everything else that they've put out, we've sort of, as a society, come to understand the Bible in the way that they understand the Bible. And the reality of the situation is that, like, that's just one way to understand these texts. And to be honest, it's kind of the laziest way to understand these texts. And nobody asked my opinion, but it's my channel. It feels very anti-Jewish because we're telling the Jewish people how they should understand their own texts. And then when they say, actually, this is how we understand it, we say, well, you're going to hell. So, and maybe not your everyday person, right? But like, I was talking to someone the other day that was saying, like, well, I just don't get it because Jesus is in the Old Testament, and so I'm struggling. How is there these prophecies in the Old Testament, but I don't. Jesus isn't, God. And I was like, go talk to a rabbi, or quite literally any Jewish person. Like, it doesn't even have to be a rabbi, but if you want like someone that you can assign like a title to, go talk to them. Because these are Jewish texts. They're Hebrew texts. They're not evangelical Christian texts. And Mark and I have had conversations about how, of course, different people can read different things in different meanings, and there can be however many meanings you care to impart to it. But it doesn't make you the authoritative voice on somebody else's history, identity, and texts. Amen. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Fighting weeds with weeds. If you're in the weeds and you're fighting in the weeds about weeds, you will just get more weeds.
Yeah,
you have to transcend it. You've got to come above it, and then you can have a different discussion.
Totally. Okay, so last question before we take the questions from the audience. So again, if you are in the audience and you have a question, this is like your last chance, tag me and we'll put you in the queue. Sorry, let me move this over. So if we determine that the Exodus, as described in the Hebrew Bible, is not historically reliable, but we do think that there is some kernel of historical reality behind it, what are the main theories that scholars have set forth? For example, what does cultural memory in this context look like?
Is that directed at any one person?
It's directed to everyone, but I think you could kick it off.
Okay, sure. Well, cultural memory, when I talk about it with my undergraduate students, is like the best example of cultural memory that I've seen in recent years, it's already a couple of years old now, but there was a Super Bowl ad a number of years ago for, I think, Jaguar. And you had Ben Kingsley and Tom Hiddleston and Mark Strong, these guys with very strong British accents, looking at the camera saying, have you ever noticed that in Hollywood movies, all the bad guys are played by Brits? And, and they go through all the qualities that make a good, James Bond bad guy, kind of British bad guy. And the end of the commercial is, and they all drive Jaguars, And so I talked to my students about it. I'm like, well, I mean, I think it's a great commercial. And I used to be a filmmaker, and I love commercials because you gotta tell a whole film, sometimes in 15 to 30 seconds, and the whole story has really got to come together visually. But that I said to my students, why do you think Hollywood, which, in the early 20th century emerged as a sort of, crucible for American identity myth making in the creation of commercial cinema, why do you think they would focus on making bad guys British? Can you think of a time when Americans thought of the British as the bad guys? And when might that time have been? And everybody, was like, the Revolutionary War. I'm just like, oh, okay. So if there's a Hollywood film that's being produced by, some guy who's never been to Britain and who's always lived in, I don't know, Tucson, Arizona before he moved to Los Angeles and got his directing deal. I'm not sure how that works. Is it possible that he's making this movie and in casting the bad guy as a Brit, he's drawing from some kind of broad cultural memory of the generating circumstances that define American identity and the values that we ostensibly promote, that define who we are? And so it's a really rich conversation. And we look at some examples of this in cinema, and then we move from that to the biblical text, and we talk about how the Exodus story may actually be doing kind of the same thing. When Kara was talking about all these massively important events from the reigns of different pharaohs, these events that revolve around failure and chaos and violence and anxiety, all of these things are woven into the Exodus story because whoever is writing this story and rewriting this story is drawing from a wellspring of cultural memory about definitive events from several centuries ago, the same way that the people who made the Jaguar commercial are drawing from the cultural memory of the US versus Britain, circa 1775 to 1780 or whatever the case might be, before things started to change. So I do think that narrative can preserve real historical memories and speak to and tell us a little bit about actual historical events, but we have to look at it as a reflection of and a reflection on what those events might have meant to people as opposed to what those events actually were.
And if I'm going to give this a cultural memory, I would say that Egypt can fit much more in the creation of this Exodus story than might be supposed as a larger cross-community creation, because the story to me is everyone grappling with what is the first millennium going to be. And as one is in the first millennium, how do you understand the breakdown of that great power and the creation of this other great power and our space in between these two things? And how do we situate ourselves? The Egyptians are going to take, the Egyptians have still not come to terms with the loss of their Bronze Age self, right? Let that settle. In the same way that the British have not come to terms with the loss of their empire, in the same way that the Americans have no idea what to do with the loss of their hegemony on the world stage, right? This diminishment is something that needs processing, and this processing is still incomplete in our minds. And the Egyptians need this processing as much as anybody else, because their first millennium story is going to be brutal, and it won't include a lot of Egyptian power. They will just get bulldozed over again and again by different forces. So, as a place of cultural memory, I think this story, the Exodus story, says much more about finding one's place within the first millennium than it does about the end of the second millennium. Or it doesn't matter what the story was in the second millennium. This is people trying to figure out what is the here and now. Why is everything so effed up? And who can we blame? And it's kind of like people today going, oh, it's because the immigrants, or, oh, it's because of the terrorists, or, oh, it's because of this person took my job. Whatever simple story that you're going to use to blame somebody else so that you can understand your diminished place in the world, you will do. So this, in my opinion, this story is a first millennium creation to understand one's place in that world. So I mean, yeah.
Josh, I have a quick question for you before we move on to the audience. We've spoken before about how you use the conquest of Canaan to date, or not you, but how scholars use the conquest of Canaan to date the Exodus. And I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit on that, because I think it's useful for people to know when they're sort of confronting these arguments.
Oh, yeah, sure. And certainly not my area of expertise, but just to sort of talk about.
You just wrote a book on it. It's fine.
Yeah, but
so, we know.
I'll just summarize what the scholars say that actually do this.
Thank you.
So I mentioned it earlier. One of the reasons that the more traditional date of the 15th century has kind of gone by the wayside for the Exodus and the conquest is because of archaeological findings. And when biblical archaeologists, throughout the 19th, 20th centuries were out excavating, with the Bible in one hand and the spade in the other, that it was going to these sites in many cases, coming from conservative schools or evangelical schools, Christian universities of some sort, to try to validate what they already knew to be the case about the biblical stories. And of course, as they excavated, they found over and over and over again that actually wasn't meshing up in the way that they thought. And a really good example of this, maybe more recently, is something like, just to stick with the Exodus for a second and then move on to the conquest, is the number of people that are supposed to have left Egypt in the Exodus, right? So if you look at Exodus 12:37, it talks about 600 alafim, 600 elephs of people. In Hebrew, that's the word for 1,000, right? And so 600,000 people walking out of it. And these are just the fighting men, right? So when you factor in women and children, you're talking about estimates of 2.5 to 3 million people. Well, it's my understanding that in New Kingdom Egypt, you have 2.5 to 3 million people in all of Egypt, right? And so
I avoid demography. We must avoid demography. But go ahead. Sure.
But I mean, the idea of 2.5 to 3 million people walking out of Egypt in the New Kingdom seems just a little untenable, shall we say? Conservative evangelical scholars, picked up on this, right? And so if you read somebody like James Hoffmeyer, he'll say, well, we know that couldn't have been the case, right? We know that 3 million people couldn't have walked out of Egypt. And so the response to that sort of thing is not to say, well, we need to start thinking about the text as a whole differently, right? Their answer is, maybe the word Aleph doesn't mean 1,000 here, right? Maybe it means like a military unit. This is a smaller, so maybe we can make the number smaller. It's like, okay, come on, guys.
But why can't people look at that and say, okay, the patron of Egypt sucks. And so now that patronage has fallen, a whole shit ton of people start moving in a different direction to create their own new patronage system. It works perfectly. And there's your historicity, boom, done. I don't see it's fine.
Yeah. Because that historicity is for you and for me and for Josh and for other scholars. We're understanding history, the word history. You're the scholar too.
I'm teasing. Sorry.
I'm sorry.
No, sorry. No, stop.
and our gracious host, without whom none of us would be here.
Stop.
For all of us who are part of this conversation, and for colleagues that we work with, we understand the word history, different than the way somebody trying to plead a special case like that is using the word history. And so for what you just said, I'm on board with that. But somebody who's a fundamentalist probably wouldn't be, because they're literally understanding the word history very differently than we are. And I think that's where we run into problems talking with them.
Well, and they're understanding the biblical narrative exactly as it's written, as you're saying, to be history. And if you give them a very, and this is, I'm an ex-fundamentalist, right? If you give them this very logical, non-supernatural reason for why this would happen, they're like, no. It can't be that, because like the foundation of quite literally everything is this belief in God directing all of human history and directing it in this very specific way that's written down in this book. And so when you remove that like supernatural layer to it, it doesn't mean anything to them anymore. Like that's becomes the issue, I think, at least in my experience.
So I think that this is sort of where I find that these types of discussions, when we talk about things like the archaeology of the conquest or the period of the conquest supposed to have taken place, it's this one first step that I think we need to get people to, and to say, okay, look, you have to think differently about this. Like the way that you're reading this as a fundamentalist evangelical does not work, right? So let's just get away from that and start thinking, and again, in a more nuanced way. And so, like in the chapter on the conquest, the archaeology of the conquest period, you know, it's clear that the sites that are supposed to have been either destroyed or, you know, taken with a great deal of force, the archaeology does not reflect that taking place at any of the times that they need to be, you know, it needs to be done. So somebody like Eric Klein has written on this, and he took as his test case, I think, 8 Cisjordan sites. And said, look, we don't have these destruction layers that we need, these contexts. And so in the book, I kind of expanded a little bit. I go into the Negev, I go into to Transjordan, but talk about sites like Arad and Heshbon and Dibon, and then the more famous Jericho and Ai and Lachish and Hatzor. And there are some sites, very few, something like Hatzor that does work. Right, but it doesn't work for the traditional date. If it does work, it works for the more mainstream date of the 13th century. But in any case, like this idea that you have this horde of Israelites coming in mass and destroying these cities one after the other in this more blitzkrieg sort of, under Joshua destruction or conquest, it doesn't work. Right. And the reason that it doesn't work is so many of these sites, their late Bronze Age remains are either not, like, we don't have late Bronze Age occupation in them. And if we do, it's not this massive fortified late Bronze Age occupation. And that all makes sense, right? Because, particularly for a traditional date, but even I think for the later date, Egypt is still in control of Canaan. Right. And again, not my area, but, it's certainly in power. So this idea that these Israelites are leaving Egypt to move into Egypt, right? It's a place that's under the control of Egypt is just incredibly problematic.
Joshua, you literally destroyed Canaan. So I'm not really sure how you can say that's not your area of expertise. Like
fair. Touche.
Okay. Before we take any more questions or questions from the audience, does anybody else have anything they want to say on that topic?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Cool. All right. Let's jump right in then. No Name asked, what if we push the Exodus date back closer to 1650? What if? I don't know if there's a second part to that.
Go for it.
Yeah.
Let us know how it works out.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know.
The problem is that if you're going to do that, most people who are motivated to do that are looking for ways to reconcile the biblical narrative as they've received it with historical fact and evidence. And if you want to push the Exodus date back to closer to 1650, then you have to move the date of the patriarchs back even earlier than that. And the problem, and I'm not saying that the stories about the patriarchs are historical either. I think that they're largely symbolic. And there's been a lot of work done on the levels of memory and the levels of transmission in these stories. But, if you are going to take the stories of the patriarchs seriously, because you want to take the Exodus seriously as well, some of the patriarchs are living right around that time too. So, you can't have Abraham and Isaac living, at exactly the same time, give or take 50 to 100 years as an Exodus that you want to have happen, when the text also tells you that there was a 400-something year gap between them. So that unfortunately doesn't work. I'm not going to say unfortunately, but that just doesn't work either. I mean, it's not helpful.
It also makes your king not Egyptian.
Right.
So I never understood this, why the Hyksos kings need to be brought into this to such a degree, if that's what's happening with the 1650 date. But I'll also point out that one can see the Ramessid kings as rather non-Egyptian too. And I'm sure there were some Thebans who looked at the family of Ramses I as rather Levantine, rather East Delta, rather other. So, but yeah, it makes it, what's Egyptian then? And who's Pharaoh? It's problematic.
And certainly, I mean, you know, the elephant in the Canaanite room, I suppose, would be that you have to deal with the Amarna period, right? And what's going on in Canaan in the Amarna period. Look, we know, right? We know a lot about it. So this, like, you don't have in the mid 14th century, Joshua setting up, you know, you just don't have that. So yeah, I think actually the earlier you go, the more problematic it becomes, because you're getting further and further away from the earliest reference that we have to Israel as a group of some sort in the Merneptah. So,
but then again, taking something super broadly, cultural history, all of these things. I mean, the idea of there being a cultural memory of there being so many people from West Asia that they settled in Egypt in such numbers that they took over Egypt, and that this fear or worry still persists all for hundreds of years is perfect. And it fits the story that there are too many of them and they must be, or a host has left us, but there are too many of them and they have to leave, or they have to be killed or culled. It fits. So yeah, so I think you can include it in a very, very broad narrative that takes hundreds of years to develop.
One thing that might be helpful for people who are trying to maybe read the Exodus story for the first time from a non-fundamentalist perspective, and if you're one of those people, I give you credit, because it's a very daunting enterprise. I mean, that's not the world that I was brought up in. I was brought up in a pretty progressive yet pretty at the same time traditional Jewish environment, where these kinds of questions and problems weren't even on the menu of what we had to deal with or ask. But if you are reading it for the first time from a non-fundamentalist perspective or a non-theological perspective, it's really helpful to think about the story as not, I wouldn't call it a work of art, but what art does for us today. So when we're watching a film like Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal, which I believe came out in 1956, it's a movie about the Black Death in the Middle Ages, but it was produced at a time when the potential for nuclear Armageddon was right around the corner at the height of the Cold War, or one of the heights of the Cold War. And so when you're watching a story that's taking place in the Middle Ages, but is dealing with issues that a later audience would have cared about, that's one way to think about this story as well. And a later audience, you know, in the first millennium, would have remembered lots of different things from much earlier and condensed them into a symbolic narrative that, you know, does touch in a hypertextual way on several different things at once, and sort of telescopes them into a single story that connects you conceptually to a world that was not so long ago, but long enough ago that you don't remember it personally, and your ancestors don't either, or your living ancestors don't. So I think looking at the story as in a similar way that we might look at a film like Bergman's film, and bringing that kind of sensibility to what levels of discourse are going on and who the intended audience is, might help even later audiences like us try to make sense of the vagaries that we encounter in the text.
Awesome. Correa, do you want to go ahead and bring the next question up? Sorry, when I got booted, somehow I can't see the starred questions anymore. What was the role of scribal schools and guilds in preserving and or altering the stories and histories in Egypt, Israel, and Mesopotamia? I feel like someone wrote a book on this. Named Josh.
It wasn't me.
Not across the ancient Near East, but
yeah, certainly. I mean, I could talk about Mesopotamia, but really most of my focus was on the second millennium. But yes, so maybe that'll be a good place to start. But scribal education, the evidence that we really have, the first serious evidence that we have of it in Mesopotamia is from the 18th century, roughly, BCE. And this is, you know, from places like Nippur, the city of Nippur, at House F. And basically scribes learned their trade by copying and memorizing. And so, I did my dissertation on the Mesopotamian city of Kish and the tablets that were found there. And basically they memorized these things like lists or model contracts or proverbial, different proverbs, and then they eventually moved on to entire literary texts. So stories about Gilgamesh, stories about Enmerkar and Anna, these other major pieces of literature. And so when you have the idea of preservation, at least in stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, they're copying out these Sumerian precursors or these Sumerian stories about Gilgamesh that are ultimately going to be brought together into something like the Epic of Gilgamesh or into the Epic of Gilgamesh. But you also have, from like a liturgical standpoint, during the Old Babylonian period, this period of the early second millennium, you have these liturgies that are being prayed by particular priests to appease the hearts of the gods, and they're very fluid. There's a lot of individual influence that one could have on a particular text or group of texts. But as you come down into the first millennium, that stuff starts to get standardized. And so, in the first millennium, now you have, not quite in the sense that we fundamentalist evangelicals would think, but more canonical versions of these texts that are far more standardized. And so, I think scribal education played a huge role in the ultimate stabilization, maybe, and transmission of these texts, and ultimately came down and influenced things like the Hebrew Bible through this, type of dependence that these writers of the Hebrew Bible had on Mesopotamian, Ugaritic, other types of texts.
I feel like I've been living in the Old Babylonian period recently.
I can imagine.
Mark or Kara?
I can speak very briefly about Israel and Judah. There's been a lot of debate in my field among scholars who think that much of the Hebrew Bible texts are very late. In other words, they're from the period of the Babylonian exile or later, because only then would people have had literate training. And I have all kinds of problems with that, some of which is that it ignores more recent evidence, anthropological and archaeological, suggesting that literacy was not widespread, but access to literate resources was more widespread than what some of these scholars would argue. But it also sometimes stinks of this idea that biblical texts are parasitic off of greater cultures, and these Jewish scribes are only capable of writing sophisticated literature because they're stealing from better people. And there's a little bit of anti-Semitism woven into that. I don't think the people who preserve that position are personally anti-Semitic, but anti-Semitism and all kinds of bigotries can be sort of institutionally transmitted, even if individuals are not, they don't have a particular, dog in that fight. So my view, and the view of, I think, a lot of scholars in my field, is that there was limited but persistent literacy throughout much of monarchic Israel. It rises in pitch in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. And then by the time you do have the Babylonian exile and the subsequent Persian period, you do have very sophisticated trained scribes that are drawing from Persian imperialism, Babylonian imperialism, and older native Israelite and Judahite traditions. And a lot of the text that we have in the Pentateuch, I do think has monarchic origins. It comes from, 800 to 600 BCE or something along those lines. Some of the traditions might even be earlier. They might be oral/written, and there's a real sort of oral and written dance going on between these sources. Oral traditions can affect the way written traditions are retextualized and transmitted, and written traditions affect the way oral traditions develop and form as people are reading and reciting and sometimes performing texts. So in this matrix, scribes are really important because they're not just, secretaries, or they're not just copyists. They're actually sacred or sacral intermediaries. They have social and liturgical and even cosmic responsibilities. In fact, the book of Deuteronomy, which most scholars would date to the latter part of the 7th century BCE, sometime around 620 BCE, maybe a little bit before, the book of Deuteronomy really presents its own writtenness as what makes it holy. Not the fact that it's revelation, but that it's written revelation, and that the people who are writing it and transmitting it and recopying it and retransmitting it in recopied form, that's part of what makes it revelation. It's a cosmic text. And so if you're dealing with a culture that views text as sort of a portal to the divine, I mean, the living voice of God preserved in the text, it's still speaking, then the pen that makes that happen, and the person who holds the pen, and the people who are entrusted with those texts are part of the equation as well. So scribes have a very, very important social role, as well as a political role, and a very, very important religious role wrapped into all of that in ancient Israel at that time.
I would just like to quickly jump in and say that while anti-Semitic and other bigoted views can be institutionalized and passed down, it's our job as responsible citizens and people that have platforms, not talking to the three of you, everyone else, to interrogate what's passed down to us for bigotry, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not an excuse for us to say like, oh, well, this is the institutional belief, therefore like it's not anti-Semitic and I can just parrot it and I don't need to think about it in a critical way. Like, no, it's all of our responsibilities to think about all of our beliefs and interrogate them, because we grow up in cultures where this stuff is institutionalized and just part of the narrative, and it shouldn't be.
Yeah, once you're aware of it, if you just sort of passively say, well, this is the way it is, then you're complicit.
Right.
And if I could, like, this is why I think it's so important. I feel like I catch a lot of flack all the time from people in more fundamentalist circles, but I also catch it from people in atheistic circles, and that's okay. I mean, I think it's okay for that to happen, because I think it's a question of explaining it correctly. But like the title of that chapter, the last chapter in the book was, did the Old Testament plagiarize? And the answer is no, right? But people in circles that I frequent don't like that, but they don't understand what I'm saying, right? And I don't think they understand what they're saying. So when they make comments like, stupid Bronze Age goat herders or something, it's like, please don't talk anymore, right? Like you just
this
don't
is what
understand.
You're doing.
Yeah, this is what I want you to do. And so, because nuance is so important, and I don't think when we're making these arguments against people like Christian apologists, we don't have to go to such extremes when we discuss these things. So saying things like, oh, well, they just stole everything, from the previous culture. Nobody would say that Eminem stole, right, from Joan Jett. Like that's when he did his song. I know I always use that example, sorry, but like he didn't stay. It was a brilliant piece of work that he
loves this song.
I really do, right? Because it's such a great example in so many ways, I think. But he certainly, I mean, you can hear Joan Jett's voice in the song, right? But that it's a new piece of work. It's artistry. He's doing something brilliant with it. And so when you read through something like the primeval history in Genesis 1-11, stop thinking about it in these terms of, well, they were just so dumb they had to just lift it from. That's not what's happening. It's in so many ways, I think it's a brilliant polemic against what it is that and they're bringing older traditions. I think they're bringing older traditions and reworking them in such a way to say something very specific, and that's brilliant. So yeah,
it's the Beastie Boys phenomenon, Paul's Boutique. I mean, that album, which it also released in 1989, it's a hell of a good year for lots of good things. Very auspicious that you were born in that year. Paul's Boutique. The entire background for all the vocals on that album was produced by a production team called the Dust Brothers, and they sampled all these phenomenal soul records and blues records and jazz records from the 50s and the 60s and 70s, and they created a tapestry, which then forms the background for the reinterpretation that the Beastie Boys offer through using it as the beat background for their own lyrics and for their own songs. The album is calling attention to its own sources, but it's also doing something with the sources that is unique and creative. And I think that when we look at ancient scribes, whether we're talking about Egyptian scribes or Greek scribes or Mesopotamian scribes or Israelite or Judahite scribes, whatever the scribes might be, we have to think of them in similar terms. They're participating in a cultural conversation, and they're providing a new way of packaging and repackaging and re-experiencing these very, very old tropes.
Kara?
I mean, obviously, it's hard to talk about this from an Egyptian perspective as you're moving into the first millennium and you've got 21st and 22nd, 23rd, 24th dynasty narratives. It's not easy. I'll say that scribalism in Egypt will always be enmeshed with religious priesthood. And the priesthood at this time period is quickly privatizing with a lack of state funding and state control. And you see all kinds of interesting things happening during this time period. A reliance on oracle revelation. This is not something that's just happening in West Asia. It's happening in Egypt too. So instead of the ad hoc decision making of king and his lieutenants, you have people in the absence of that strong power looking to God, however you understand that, to make decisions such that they are not responsible for an economic decision about somebody's inheritance or where land ownership will be transferred, things like that. And I will also point out that if you have similar things like that, these priests, scribes are also grappling with the idea of what God is and how one should understand it, such that by the 7th century, maybe even earlier, there seems to be a reaction against Seth, a god of destruction, a god of Levantine deserts and storms. And Seth is systematically removed from temples in the first millennium. More work needs to be done on this. It's something that's really interesting to me, but where does that fit into this whole discussion? Who's making these decisions? Why is this storm god considered so problematic? Why is Osiris then lauded as Seth essentially becomes a kind of devil, which is not the case in the Bronze Age. Seth is a god of great violent power and he's necessary. To remove him from temple spaces is it anti-Ramessid? Is it anti-West Asia? What's going on there? So there's, I'm throwing out a couple of examples here and there. Scribalism is not my jam, and I'll leave it to you guys. But yeah, it's interesting.
Thank you. Correa, will you please bring up the next question? What are your thoughts on David Roll's chronology? I don't have any.
I don't have any. Anyone?
Yep.
Never heard of
thoughts,
him.
Vibes here. All right.
I feel bad at
Sorry.
questions like this because when I first came on to YouTube, people said, "Oh, you're a Sumerologist. You read Sumerian. So, what do you think of?" And now I'm forgetting his Zachariah Sitchin, right? Do you guys know who Zachariah Sitchin is? Yeah, neither did I. And he's written prolifically, apparently, on like the Anunnaki and ancient aliens, but it's all based on the use of Sumerian. And I was like, like Kara was saying earlier, we don't talk about that. I don't know who that is, right? So sorry.
You did get me interested with the mention of ancient aliens, which I think is what the History Channel has now basically become, like all day, all night, and in stereo.
Yeah,
So
pretty
is,
much.
So is CNN. So
Maybe it will change under the new leadership. Who knows?
Next question, please. I think we kind of talked about this, but if anybody has any additional thoughts, would the panel address claims that everything in the Hebrew Bible is stolen, ripped off, plagiarized from ancient Near Eastern neighbors? The Exodus narrative does seem quite unique.
Short answer, no.
Yes.
With an if. Yes. Long answer, yes, with a but.
Yeah,
So I think we did touch on it. Sorry, Josh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, this is how it worked with literature.
Yeah.
So the example that I gave just from Mesopotamian sources, how there are two Akkadian texts. One utilized the earlier, and that's the Anzu myth from the early second millennium, which is about the god Ninurta, who has this rise to preeminence over the other deities, and that myth is reworked very blatantly in the late second millennium in the very famous Enuma Elish, which is the story about Marduk, who's rises to power, and it pulls not just in theme or in motif, or in broad storyline, but very specifically in some of the lexicon, some of the syntax, some of the lexemes that come across. It's very intentional that they're reusing it, but what they're doing is they're creating in the mind of the reader or the listener, they're conjuring up the image of the god Ninurta, whom they know to be this very powerful warrior deity, and transferring that to Marduk and saying, but Marduk is Ninurta 2.0. And it's such a beautiful thing if you read both texts, you'll see it. Just in English, you'll see it. But it's so beautiful the way that scholars have shown this to be the case, and what the nuances, the things that are being reused and reworked, and the ideas that are being accentuated. This is how they did it. And so this idea that it's just this flat sort of unsophisticated, it's stolen, or they lifted it, or what, man, please, let's get away from that, because it's so beautiful what they do.
Is do better.
Yes,
but also
we all do.
It says more about our own identity building in a need to create some sort of original revelation that builds us up into the best and the first and the only, rather than in the ancient world, or just the most of the way societies work, is there's more power in derivatives. There's more power in building upon what already exists. And so I would rather base it in that narrative. But yeah. Is that a dog? What is that?
I don't know what that is, and I don't know where it's coming from.
I don't hear anything.
It's a bird. It's a bird.
It's a bird.
Oh,
Mark,
no.
if you mute for a second, we could probably narrow it down.
hold on a second. Hold on.
There.
Oh, okay. I thought it was coming from out my window, but apparently it's coming through my headphones. So that's interesting.
Oh, wow.
Oh, alrighty then. Okay. Next question, please. Also, Dan says deep Simpsons cut, Mark.
That's just scratching the surface, man. I go way hard on The Simpsons. I stopped watching in 2008 when the episode was uh-oh, Homer joins Cheech and Chong. That's it. I was out after that. But up until that point, I saw everything.
Okay. Next question, please.
It's like a hawk.
Hello? Is anybody home?
There
Thank
we
you.
go.
For anyone, thoughts on Moses being an Egyptian name and what that might mean for the possibility of a historic figure?
I mean, I think I already, but the best example is Amen-Messe of the 19th dynasty, who is called a pretender king, but is he a pretender king or just a rival king? He was almost certainly related to Ramses II in some way, and it seems that he's fighting Seti II at the end of the 19th dynasty. Amen-Messe builds a whole lot at Thebes. He's got structures that he puts up, texts, images of himself. And from the village of Dir el-Medina, there is an ostracon that preserves a kind of shortened version of his name that shows their connection to him, an intimate connection with this king, and they call him Mesu. So that's the closest I can come up with. What that means, I don't know. It's funny because if you're looking at this through the traditional Egyptian lens, then you'll think of Seti II as being the Levantine dude, who's more the West Asian guy, and Amen-Mesu as being the Theban, more Egyptian than Egyptian dude, conservative old Egyptian ways. So why the Mesu would be on that side, it doesn't make sense. So I got nothing there, but that's the closest I can get. Messes, yeah, it's also a diminutive for Ramses. So it's like the son of a Ramessid king, this Mesu, and then it connects with him being an adopted son into that royal family. So maybe that's all it is. It's a diminutive of Ramses.
Anybody else want to jump in on that?
I will say that there's debate in my field about whether there was a historical Moses, and I have a couple colleagues who I love as very dear friends and who I respect as brilliant scholars who have made the case that there was never a historical Moses. He's purely a figure of legend. I would nuance that, and I would say that I do think there was somebody like Moses who existed in antiquity, what we can say about this person is very, 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 very slight. There are wisps of some traditions about this person that are preserved in the depiction of this person across the Pentateuch and some other sources in the Hebrew Bible that I think are relatively old. But that doesn't mean that tells us an awful lot about Moses. So, the Moses that we read about having a conversation with God on Mount Sinai, being like, it's the most Jewish Moses, where he says to God, just kill me now. I can't take these people anymore. Just kill me now. I mean, I've heard my grandmother and my mom and my aunt and everybody's Jewish grandmother and mom and aunt. I mean, they've all said that at some point.
Catholics do this.
Catholics probably too. Yeah. I think it's just kind of a universal complaint. But I mean, it humanizes Moses, but like, that's clearly a literary figure, right? That's the literary Moses that we encounter. But I do think that we can say a very, very tiny bit about whoever the historical Moses was. And what we can say about him largely has to do with his legacy among the priests that descend from him, or at least who claim descent from him, who are called the Mushites. There are, which comes from Moshe, which is his Hebraicized name, how it would have been pronounced in ancient Israel, and how it's still pronounced today among Hebrew speakers. So I think that anything that we can say about Moses that might be a deeply ancient tradition is filtered through a lineage of priests that were quite powerful in the pre-monarchic period called the Mushites, and they're thinking of an eponymous ancestor. And somebody like that ancestor must have founded the priestly line, because anthropologically speaking, that's how priesthoods develop in peasant economies and in agrarian societies. But it doesn't tell us a lot about him, and we have to be very, very, very cautious if we want to say anything historical about that person.
Thank you.
And if I could, because like I feel like when I use this example, it casts this into very clear light. I feel like people in these discussions with whom we have these discussions online, it's like a light switch, right? Did he exist or did he not exist? Well, if he existed, then everything that we see in the text is true about him, right? And that's where that sort of goes. That's why people are making that argument. I feel like I hear this about Jesus as well, right? Did he exist? Oh, then all those things. Anyway, but nobody has a problem with this when we say the name Gilgamesh. Right, because did Gilgamesh exist as a king of Uruk in the 3rd millennium? Probably. I mean, like, we have pretty decent evidence that he existed. Does that mean that he ran through a tunnel to outrun the sun? Right? Did he have Enkidu come back up from the netherworld and talk to him about all the people? He said no. Right? Like, what? Why would anybody think that? Did he go or get to the end of the world and cross the sea that goes to the flood survivor and find that? No, of course not. Right? But did Gilgamesh exist? Yeah. I mean, it's king of Uruk, right? People see that very clearly. Just because somebody existed, even if it is that person by that name upon whom these things are based, it doesn't mean that all the shit that's written about them in these these texts, these pieces of literature is true, and that we should be determining our eternal destiny based on the things that surround it. Anyway,
but if I were going to do like a television series about this, I would have it based on an internal disagreement within the court between the king and those below him, that next generation, and Mesu being Meses being a diminutive of Ramesses, then it would, and this being a Levantine kingship in many ways, maybe there is a division between where one's loyalties lie. And given that we are going to have a civil war between North and South, in many ways, this situates very well into an Egyptian divided political scheme. And so I put it in that narrative direction. But
okay, next question, please. For Mark, can you elaborate on the Exodus being based on secession from Solomon? Was Egypt inserted as the villain by later Judahite scribes?
Oh, really good question. So I've written an article or two on this, and I probably will write one or two more before I move on to something probably more interesting and relevant. So I'll just try to summarize what I think about it. I think that there was a very, very old tradition by the time of the rise of the monarchy. In other words, there was already a 200-ish year old tradition in monarchic Israel, early monarchic Israel, that Israel's ancestors broke from Egypt. it might not have been more defined than that. It might have simply been our ancestors broke from Egypt, our ancestors broke from Egypt, our ancestors broke from Egypt. And that might have been a sort of myth of identity that was recited in festivals and in prayers, and maybe affected development of social identity in different corners of early Israel. So I think that because there was already a sort of anti-Egyptian ethos in early Israel, it was easy for people writing after Solomon's death to justify leaving Solomon's empire and the empire of his son Rehoboam by likening them to the Egyptians. And then by retelling the Egyptian story through the prism of the recent experience with the Davidic kings in Jerusalem. So there's a sort of a dance back and forth. There's an old tradition about breaking with Egypt that informs how people might have seen their actual experience with Solomon. And then there's the actual experience with Solomon and his son, Rehoboam, that winds up influencing the writing of a narrative about the Exodus from Egypt. So again, one thing that I think we should think about is that there's always a dance going on between oral traditions and written traditions. And the way one forms a sort of crucible for how the other might unfold, that's really worth thinking about when we think about how the story would resonate with early readers, but then how later readers, centuries later, or even more than just centuries later, would perceive what was eventually codified down in textual form and fixed in textual form. And we know that the Exodus story as we now have it might have started in written form during the reign of King Jeroboam as propaganda for him coming to power, likening him to Moses leading the people into freedom. But it developed over several hundred years. And there was a really, really good article about this by Nadav Naaman. I think it was published in 2010, but he really walks through the multiple layers of the Exodus story as we now have it. And what it tells us is that this story was so powerful, and the potency, the world-making potency, the identity-forming potency of the story is so powerful that even by the time of the priestly writer, in the Babylonian exile, or even probably a little bit after, the Exodus from Egypt is still motivating new stuff to be deposited into this archive of tradition that we now have as the book of Exodus. So it's a sort of a self-generating story, but it had moments that generated it as well.
Thank you. The last question, is there any connection between Yahweh and PTAH? I don't know.
No, I wouldn't connect Yahweh with Patah. I would instead connect Yahweh with Seth. And Seth, this is where things get really interesting. It's like, the Egyptian narrative keeps speaking to me, or the Exodus narrative vis-a-vis Egypt keeps speaking to me in part as if Egypt is breaking up with itself, which indeed it is. So there's, the story has the adopted son of the Pharaoh breaking up with Pharaoh, right? There's also this subtext that all of a sudden in the 19th dynasty, you get kings with names that are so problematic and so West Asian, so Levantine, so anti-Osirian, that in Seti's temple at Abydos, for instance, Seti, his name is Seth, right? He has to change his name because he's putting that temple in the sacred burial ground of the god Osiris. And Seth is the one who murdered his brother Osiris, such that Isis has to go collect his body parts that he's scattered all over and put him back into the first mummy, have sex with him, create Horus, and there's this whole cycle that is created. But in this sacred burial ground, when Seth is like, oh my goodness, I know I'm foreign, I know I'm of this Eastern Delta people, Levantine origins, mercenary origins, I've got to be more Egyptian than Egyptian. I'm going to build the most awesome temple people have ever seen, and I'm going to put it at Abydos, ground zero for Egyptian kingship, the oldest kingship there ever was, and the purported burial ground of Osiris himself. And when he does this, he cannot use his own name. Instead of writing the Seth animal in the cartouche, in the most beautiful temple I've ever been to, it's one of the few limestone temples that wasn't broken up for the lime kilns in the Ottoman Industrial Revolution. Instead, it stands, and if you've never been to Seti the First Temple at Abydos, it's got to be like on your bucket list because it's insanely beautiful. And in each cartouche, Seti cannot use the Seth animal. He instead uses different things, like he'll use the protection knot Tit. It's hard to pronounce that in a webinar and not sound dirty. But he uses the teat knot, and it's a way of sportively writing his name. So there's all kinds of issues from the Egyptological side where we can see that there are cultural misunderstandings, cultural tensions happening in the 19th dynasty and on into the 20th that find their way in many ways in this Exodus story that if you look at it from through a purely biblical lens, you will not see. And that's where we need more of this kind of cross-disciplinary discussion, so that you can really see, oh my God, in the Egyptian narratives, it could be this or that, and this is what's going on in the second millennium, first millennium BCE, and how one could work it. So, Ptah is the craftsman god of Memphis. Memphis is there at the apex of the Nile, a little bit further south of modern day Cairo. He's a very old Egyptian god, not associated with storms, not associated with the deserts to the east. Different kind of thing. So Seth is where you want to go to. That's where it gets really interesting.
That is really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, any last thoughts from anyone? All right, so I have kept all of you way over time. I'm so sorry. Thank you all for being here. I have had a great time and I've learned a ton, and I think a lot of people, I assume everybody watching has as well. Before we go.
I would like to say, sorry, just because you asked. For everybody watching, I think this is for our community. This is such an important panel. It's such an important discussion that was had here. So obviously like the video, comment on it, but share it out, because I really do think that these, particularly Mark and Kara coming together, this panel was something I've been very, very excited to just be a part of. So please do share it out, because I think people need to hear this perspective in all of the different communities that we've talked about today.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah, agreed.
Yeah. So again, thank you all so much. It's been an honor and a pleasure. Before we go, I would like to give everyone the opportunity to tell folks where they can find you, where they can buy your books, if you have anything coming up that you'd like to share. Yeah. So Mark, you want to kick it off because you're next to me?
Yeah, sure. But you can find me in Philadelphia. I mean, just walk down the street. If you see me, say hi.
West Philadelphia?
Born and raised. Actually, no. That too is deep cut. No, I'm Canadian actually, but I live in Philadelphia at Temple University. That's where you can find me. Oh, you did you?
Yeah.
Well, as Josh was talking about Joan Jett and Eminem, I'm just kind of thinking, don't talk about Rush, don't talk about Rush, don't talk about Rush, because I will not stop. And it was between this T-shirt and a Rush concert T-shirt, and this shirt went out. But
triggered.
Anyway,
Rush, no.
No. All right, that's all I got. Thanks.
They can find you on.
Oh yeah, you can. I am on Twitter at Mark Leuchter. And come and say hi, and please be nice. And if you're not nice, that's okay. It's just Twitter.
You're not nice. I'm there.
Right.
Yeah.
I have somebody in my corner who will get you. So watch out.
All right. Thank you, Josh.
Yeah. So we're over at Digital Hammurabi. And actually, Dr. Cooney just came and did an interview with Megan, and Megan is a much better speaker than I am. So having the two of them together is just really, really nice. It was a great interview. We just published a book. This is shameless, the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, Volume 2. So we talk about the Exodus and the conquest and the what scholars say about it, just generally speaking. So yeah, love it if you got a copy of that.
Awesome. And we've linked all of this stuff in the show notes, but.
Oh, awesome. Thank you.
All right. Kara, Dr. Cooney.
Yeah, I'm on all the socials. I have a podcast called Afterlives with Kara Cooney, in which I work with a millennial co-host. We have a Gen X millennial sort of vibe going on. Jordan Gelsinski is my co-host, and we have a lot of fun. And the book that's been pissing them all off is this one, Absolute Power in the Ancient World and the Modern World. And yeah, there you go. And it's everywhere books are sold. You'll find it. I read the audiobook if you'd like to do that, but don't fall asleep listening to the audiobook. I found that is dangerous, especially if you're one of my students. So don't do that.
Don't do that. You also have another book that I ordered. It hasn't come yet. About like female leaders. Yeah, exactly. Looks super interesting for anyone that's like interested in a more feminist sort of take, or not even feminist, but just like being more aware of women in the ancient world. It looks like a super good book.
And if we could try to get to a place where women are ruling the world again, that would be awesome. Thank you.
Well, they never did. And when they do rule, they always serve the patriarchy, which is the wah-wah of the book, and why a lot of people who try to write revisionist histories of these women and, you know, create your 6th grade hot chefs so that girls can rule, girl boss kind of thing. I cut that off at the knees and
girl boss too
say
close to the
how women can serve the patriarchy best, and it's depressing. But we humans are going through another human revolution.
It's depressing and timely.
It is. But if you want to learn more about what I think about the new human revolution that humans are currently embarking on, an anti-patriarchal revolution, you can read the last chapter of The Good Kings, and I have more to say about that there. Yeah.
I don't have a book to plug, but I am releasing an album of depressing music reflecting on just these very issues. So it's called
music that makes you cry.
Music to cry to.
It's mostly angry stuff. So right. You'll get pissed off. You might not cry, but who knows? Maybe you will. But you know, I don't know exactly when I'm going to release it. I have to finish mixing it, but it's going to be called Mid-Century because I'm turning 50. So
yay! I just turned 50. It's super.
All right.
You need to go to Vegas with a bunch of friends, and just what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, and it's really
okay. Vegas is a little warm for me. I might just go to Nashville instead.
You heard it here first. If you see Kara in Vegas, no, you didn't. All right. Y'all already know where to find me on all the places. Please like, subscribe, do all of that stuff. Share the video. I do think it's really important. And go show these lovely, intelligent people some love. And on that note, I'll see y'all next time. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Oh, shit. You done fucked up, man. Ain't nothing but a gangsta party.